You are listening to the serialized audiobook podcast for Blood of the Stars, an epic fantasy novel written by Karyne Norton, read by Paeter Frandsen and Karyne Norton. If you can't wait to listen to the whole audiobook, or if you want a signed physical copy, go to karynnorton.com/shop to get the lowest cost by buying direct. You can also find the audiobook on Audible, Barnes & Noble, and other standard retailers. Please enjoy the next installment of Blood of the Stars by Karyne Norton. Chapter 74. No. Eliana backed away from the table. Absolutely not. If he's killed, I'm no longer branded. It defeats the whole purpose.
No,
Silmar said.
If he's killed, the part of you that was branded by him is free. Half of your willpower will be free to fight Mavis.
How would she get his blood in time to do a brand on him?
If you continue to underestimate her, you're better off staying here, he barked.
I'd rather you killed me than Jasperus. She continued her retreat until she bumped into the tent's frame, her stomach roiling. Silmar shook his head.
That's not an option.
Why not?
You're too valuable.
I'm no more valuable than Jasperus. If anything, I'm less. I'm a liability. She glanced at Kendallin for support, but the other woman crossed her arms and looked away.
You're wrong,
Karyne said.
You have claim to Mavis's throne. Mavis doesn't hold a throne,
Silmar snapped.
My parents gave her the Eastern Province.
Eliana's stomach dropped.
She officially became Queen Mavis around the same time we were walking through human remains in Islara.
Karyne's hand tightened around the pommel of his sword. Silmar's face paled above his beard, making his scars stand out.
Why? It was supposed to be a diplomatic move.
Karyne ran a hand through his hair, but still kept the other balanced on his sword.
Anla explained it to me, but her reasoning was weak. It all goes back to the story Aura told about two brothers fighting over a throne.
Everyone glanced toward the tent corner, but Aura might have been sleeping in the shadows for how little she reacted.
I don't want a throne,
Eliana said. I hardly even want my magic.
But if those people were given a choice,
Karyne said, pointing out toward the camp,
they'd all rather you had it than Mavis. Maybe even more than your mother. How fit can she be to rule after 10 years as Mavis's brand?
General Nels and his soldier exchanged guilty glances. Perhaps Karyne wasn't too far off in his assessment.
Why are you telling us this?
Silmar asked.
She would threaten the throne of your family.
Karyne shrugged.
It's the truth. Besides, I'm not so sure my family should be ruling.
Like a wave, heads around the tent bent together, murmuring over Karyne's words.
None of this,
Silmar shouted over everyone,
changes the fact that Eliana can only come if she agrees to our contingency plan. She has to be willing to give us her blood so Jasperus can override Mavis's brand with his own.
Eliana glanced at Jasperus, noticing that Silmar had left out the part about Jasperus being forced to do blood magic and then being killed.
It's all right, Jasperus said. Even if you don't agree, I plan to do the same for your mother. I'd rather die to save 2 lives than just 1. Perhaps it will undo some of what my son has done.
Instead of convincing her, his logic made her hate the situation even more. Aeliana slipped the cord from around her neck, setting her starlock on the table. A chill ran through her as she let it go. Half the people bent in for a closer look, while half scooted away like it was cursed. What if I give up my starlock? She can't do much through me without it.
It would make you too vulnerable.
Karyne stepped forward, his eyes darting between Aeliana and her starlock.
You can't go into battle without it.
A few nodded, but most everyone turned to Silmar, awaiting his response. The longer he stared at her starlock, the higher Aeliana's anxiety grew. With painstakingly slow movements, he bent forward and picked up the leather cord.
You are so much like your mother,
he said in wonder. He reached into his pocket and retrieved a second cord, an unfamiliar starlock hanging from it. This time everyone bent forward, taking in its dagger shape. Despite being less than the length of Aeliana's pinky, the dagger had intricate vines wrapping around its base, and Aeliana sensed its pointed tip could do significant damage.
That looks...
Marnock trailed off.
I feel like I've seen that before.
Is that my mother's? Aeliana asked. Iris cleared her throat, blinking fast while staring at the starlock. When Mavis came for her, Emerys asked me to take it. She suspected Mavis would brand her, so she made herself a less valuable prize. Aeliana reached for the starlock, her mind racing. She ran a finger along the smooth shaft of the blade, then the bumps of the vines and grip. What if she'd used it to fight instead? Mavis might not even have her.
I think we've all asked ourselves that question,
Silmar said.
Which is why I don't think it's wise for you to do the same thing she did.
He handed Aeliana her starlock, the warmth of the star in her left hand contrasting the cold metal of the dagger starlock in her right. But if my mother had used it, and Mavis had still caught her... Aeliana trailed off, imagining the horrors that could have brought. Mavis could already be in full power, dominating the entire country. Then we would have been asking ourselves what would have happened if my mother had given it up. We could go in circles playing this game. She tucked her mother's starlock in her pocket, unwilling to let Silmar carry it a moment longer.
The fact is, Silmar said, Jasperus is ready and willing to make his sacrifice. We could hide you in the woods or leave you here at the camp, but Mavis has ways of finding you. Eventually, she will brand you.
She closed her eyes. She wanted no part of this new plan.
If we keep you with us, you'll have better protection, Silmar said. We can intervene quicker if she brands you, and there's more chance of her staying in her tower if she suspects that you're heading her way. If she brands you and senses you've stayed behind, she might leave, ruining our chances of finding her.
Others in the group nodded, all his points making sense, even if Aeliana didn't like the inevitable outcome. So I come with you, she said, but only on the condition that I'm willing to let Jasperus sacrifice himself. She pushed down the rising heat. She was being manipulated to allow something she didn't want. and it felt strangely similar to the ways Arvid and Vera had forced her to give them her blood. Promises that it was for the best, not because it truly was, but because they were threatening to do something worse if they didn't get their way. Silmar's beard shifted as his jaw tightened.
I told you that you wouldn't always like my methods.
Eliana glanced at Jasperus, who gave her an encouraging nod. There has to be another way. She shook her head and crossed her arms over her chest. Lukai cleared his throat, then pulled a vial from his coat pocket. The entire room went still as the glass glinted in the torchlight, drawing attention to the deep brown substance within it. There is another way, Lukai said, unable to hold Eliana's gaze. He shook his head, his face turning red as beads of sweat broke out on his face. Silmar took the blood from Lukai's outstretched arm. Sharp pain shot through Eliana's bond mark, and Lukai winced, scratching at his palm as he hunched over the table.
It's hard to admit the ways you've betrayed your bondmate, isn't it?
Garen's voice held a hardness Eliana hadn't heard since they'd first found him, back when he couldn't trust the recreants. What are you talking about? She asked.
He gave me your blood.
Silmar's eyes shone, but his face remained stoic, whether to avoid looking smug or because even this couldn't make him happy. Eliana turned to Lukai, whose face pinched with guilt. How did you—
Training.
We often cut each other to practice healing. When Lukai practically choked on the words, Kendallin put her arm around him, but he shrugged her off with a moan, as if that interaction sent his bond mark's retaliation over the edge. Eliana's palm stung, and when she glanced at it, the skin around the mark appeared red and inflamed. You would both use my blood without my permission? There was a stillness to the air as everyone collectively held their breath. Silmar frowned and tossed the vial to the ground, where it bounced on the grass. Then he brought his staff down hard on the vial, breaking the glass and spilling the blood.
No. Even that's a line I'm not willing to cross. It has to be your choice.
A sob broke from Lukai's throat.
Every fiber in me fights to protect you. You have to understand. I don't want to cross that line either, but I want you safe.
Garen shook his head, muttering something about bonds that Eliana couldn't catch. She stepped forward, reaching out for Lukai, but her hand stopped just above his shoulder. Was she quick to forgive because it was her nature, or because the bond required it? She let her hand fall and stepped back once more, the reality of what he'd done sitting heavy with her. She couldn't handle addressing it now, especially with an audience. Her gaze fell on Silmar, whose brow remained raised in question. His unwillingness to use her blood without permission didn't override his manipulation to get her to hand it over. Was it truly her choice if he made it her only way to help rescue her mother? A scream threatened to work its way up her throat, but she fought it down before turning away. Tears stung her eyes as she swept the tent flap aside, afraid she might retch. As the cool night air hit her face, she sucked in its freshness, allowing it to calm her pounding heart and settle her stomach. Most of the troops had gathered around small campfires, where they ate a meager meal. The guards on either side of her glanced her way, but they made no comment. They'd likely heard the entire discussion in the tent. Murmurs started up around her, and, as her eyes adjusted, she saw the stares of the people, followed by the occasional dip of the head. A few even touched their fingers to their foreheads first, something she'd caught Karyne's men doing before he reminded them he was no longer a prince. A gesture for royalty. Rumors had spread about her identity as the daughter of Emerus and Rildon, and the curious glances at her hair and dress had shifted to desperate hope as the people examined her features, picking apart the similarities between her and her mother. Was Karyne right? Did they see her as an alternate to the throne? She strode to the edge of camp, swallowing around the lump in her throat, and tripping over twigs and stumps she was too distracted to notice in the dim moonlight. When the chatting and laughter blurred to a dull hum, she dropped to her knees and bent forward, burying her face in her hands. They asked too much of her, and yet they didn't ask enough. It wasn't Jasperus's price to pay tomorrow. She ripped off her starlock and threw it a dozen steps away. A coldness swept over her, but she fought it, momentarily reveling in its absence. It didn't have to be a part of who she was. She could be strong without it. Footsteps whispered through the grass behind her. She sat up and turned, almost eager to take her frustration out on someone. But all the anger left her when the shadows shifted to reveal Cyrus approaching. Out of everyone here, he didn't deserve her wrath. He hadn't asked to be a part of this any more than she had. He stared at her for a moment, then strode past her, bending to search the forest floor before picking up the starlock she'd thrown. When he kneeled in front of her and slipped it back over her head, she couldn't hold his gaze. The starlock settled against her chest, its heat like fire even through the fabric of her shirt, as if it were angry at being cast aside. "It's a part of you now," he said. "Even if you don't always want it to be. It's a calling from the stars. They rarely call us to carry light burdens." He tilted his head up to take in the stars' dance, the reverence on his face almost inspiring. "Every life that's lost because of me makes the burden heavier," she whispered. "When does it become too much?" "Cam's always liked to remind me that the stars will never give us more than we can bear. It's written in the Song of the Stars." He glanced at her, and his smile held a sorrow that tugged at Aeliana's heart. "Do you think that was true, even in her final moments?" Aeliana tried keeping her tone even, but the words came out raw and harsh. "When she took the brunt of my guardian's anger instead of me?" "The stars sent her aura, didn't they?" He glanced back toward the camp, even though it was impossible to make out individuals. "And they've sent you all these people, ready to stand behind you. Or even in front of you. I don't want anyone to die for me, least of all Jasperus. He's lost too much already." "That's part of the reason he's willing to fill the position." Cyrus winced at his own words, then tugged on the cord around his neck, pulling something dark out from under his shirt. He gripped it tight and hesitated, staring at his fist, not quite willing to reveal what it held. "Maybe the stars also sent me to give you another option." Eliana's heart picked up its pace. What do you have? I should have shown this to you a long time ago. At first, I thought it would be too tempting for you, that it might interfere with your efforts to wean yourself off blood magic. But the longer I had it, the more I started feeling ridiculous for having taken it in the first place. And eventually, guilty. He opened his fist for the moonlight to reveal a small vial of dark red blood resting in his palm. Eliana sat back on her heels, finally understanding his hesitation. Whose blood is that? Durakin's. Eliana's mouth swung open. How did you get the dragon's blood? The tips of his ears darkened as he lifted a shoulder. After Aura told me about Gamz's last moments, I left camp. Without really thinking about it, I ended up back at Islara's gates. Almost like seeing other people's loss might put my own into perspective. But then I also saw Durakin lying there, fast asleep. Eliana covered her eyes with her hands. You didn't. He laughed, a sound more from relief. I did. I don't know what possessed me. Curiosity, maybe? There was probably a hint of a desire for revenge, but when I got close, I saw his paw. He was branded just like you said. I didn't really know how it worked at that point, but I knew Mavis had your blood, and that gave her power over you. It felt like if we had his blood, it might eventually give us power over him. Eliana peeked between her fingers. So you just went up and cut him? He grinned sheepishly. Pretty much. And why exactly did you have an empty vial just sitting in your pocket? There was an apothecary in the building next to him. When I found an undamaged vial that had rolled out on the cobblestone, it seemed like the stars themselves were insisting I bottle it up. He pulled the leather string over his head, frowning down at the vial. Every day it grows warm while we travel, like it soaks in the sun's light, even through my tunic. And every night it gets cold, like the energy leaches back out. I understand now why Silmar and Jasperus are so convinced that branding is more powerful just before the sun's sleep. Eliana shook her head, unable to hold back her smile. So now what? You want me to give this vial to Jasperus and tell him it's my blood? Cyrus winced. I suppose you could do that. But Silmar might hold up his end of the bargain to kill Jasperus before checking the brand. Besides, maybe Jasperus won't have to brand you. He rubbed the back of his neck, the rest of his words struggling to get out, until they all tumbled through at once. Not if you first brand Durakin to you. Eliana's mouth went dry, and she stood, stepping away from Cyrus. You want me to do blood magic? It's not. He rose as well, grabbing her forearm as if afraid she might run. I understand if you don't want to. You have to do what you think is right. But I can't help thinking Silmar is right. The blood magic attracts the dark spirits. But you still have the choice to let them in. What about the rest of what he said? Jasperus doesn't have a history of blood magic, but I do. She balled her hands into fists, hating both the scars and fresh cuts she continued to find on her skin. Cuts she couldn't explain. Cyrus shook his head. You have a history of others using your blood for magic. You're tempted to use it because it's all you knew for years. But even with that upbringing, you have always refused the dark spirits. If anything,
You're the best person for this task, because you've practiced resisting them for years.
And if I fail? Everyone pays for my mistake. He shrugged, unable to counter her words. How does branding Durkin keep Jasperus from branding me?
Well, it won't unless you can get Durkin on our side. If you can cut out his brand to Mavis and get him to fight for us, we not only gain a dragon, but she loses one. If you can turn the tide of the battle before she brands you, Jasperus won't brand you either.
Eliana bit her lip, staring at the blood still in his hand. But if I do it too soon, it might push her to brand me earlier.
I didn't say it was a perfect plan. It's just another option for you.
She inhaled a deep, shaky breath, then took the vial from his hands. She couldn't believe she was even considering the idea. How do I do it? Cyrus hesitated.
Jasperus explained it to me. You choose the place you want his brand marked on you. Then cut yourself and pour his blood over your wound. Instead of healing the wound, you use your starlock to seal it. I was hoping that would make sense to you.
Eliana nodded, already imagining the difference. Healing felt more like knitting a wound together, but he was talking about covering it or encasing it.
It forms a mark on your skin like a tattoo, and simultaneously marks his palm, just like a bond, but it only goes one way.
Cyrus's hands rose with his explanation, his gestures becoming wilder with his excitement over the idea.
Durkin will sense a desire to please you without you having that same feeling in return.
His description fit with the little Silmar had told them months ago, but it also laid out exactly what she could expect if Mavis successfully branded her. And then he just does what I ask, Eliana said. There were so many points it could go wrong. She could lose control cutting herself. The dragon's attachment might be too strong to Mavis. She might not get close enough to cut out the old brand. And at any point, if Mavis branded Eliana, it would be useless.
I mean, that's the theory.
Cyrus's hands dropped, his excitement giving way to uncertainty.
You can always remove the brand when it's all over.
Free him. Somehow, that made the idea more palatable, but she still couldn't see herself using it. By the time she felt the risk was worth it, it might be too late.
While you're at it, you should consider cutting out your bond. Lukai kind of deserves it after that.
He frowned in the direction of the war room tent, shoving his hands in his robe pockets. How very unpriestlike of you. Eliana laughed, and the tension between them broke. It's a good plan, Cyrus. One I hope not to use, but still helpful. You're a good friend. He beamed at her.
Sometimes friends are better than bonds.
Eliana snorted. They're far less complicated, that's for sure.
I'm always going to look out for you, even when you send me back to Lorvandus.
His face grew somber, his freckles contrasting more in the moonlight.
Just because you stopped training as a priestess doesn't mean we stopped training together. And that's its own kind of bond. It lasts a lifetime.
Thank you, she whispered. She could never tell him that deep down she didn't want to send him back home. He was one of the people she felt safest with. But if she told him that, he would stay, and he needed to go back to Bartholom. Instead, she pulled out her mother's starlock and placed it over Cyrus's head and tucked it under his tunic. Now you can still trick the zealots, while safekeeping it for me. I can't have it in my possession when Mavis brands me." He patted his chest where it lay.
"I'm always praying for you, Eliana. Whether it's the sun or stars out, whether I'm kneeling or riding a horse, or sneaking food off the cook fire before Kendallin can burn it."
She smiled at the mental image, but a lump grew in her throat at the sincerity behind his words. "Thank you. Both the sun and stars know I need it." The next day, they pushed hard as they steadily climbed an elevation toward the Mindrin Mountains. Eliana feared they were bringing the soldiers to a state of exhaustion when they really needed rest before they laid siege to Mavis's fortress the next day. She urged her mare through the ranks, trying to spread a little bit of her energy to each of the troops to carry them through. Even though she knew she'd have to eventually give Silmar her blood, she avoided both him and Lukai until that evening, when Cyrus accompanied her to the hastily constructed war tent once more. She stood outside, gearing up the courage to seal Jasperus's fate, when it ironically felt like the far more courageous thing would be to refuse. Shouts carried across the grass from camp, and they turned, Cyrus's hand going to his hilt. Eliana scanned the camp, first for intruders, but then to see if there was an open path to her bedroll that held her bow and quiver. Crowds blocked her view, but so far she only saw their own people. She stepped away from the tent, weaving through the crowd in the hopes of finding the source of everyone's concern. But when people saw her coming, they made way, several whispering her name.
"There you are, love,"
Iris called, her hand waving over the heads of several soldiers.
"General Nels is looking for you. Says he needs you."
Her head and shoulders popped out between two beefy arms in the crowd, and she gestured for Eliana to come closer. "Me? Why me?"
"There's a Winix who's come." Iris beamed. "He's asking for you by name."
Chapter 75. Karyne grinned at the full-grown Winix snarling at General Nels, enjoying the soldier's discomfort. "He won't hurt you if you put your weapons away." Felk turned a wary eye on Karyne, a reminder that Felk hadn't met Karyne yet this cycle.
"He may have been your pet once, but he's wild now."
The general left his blade out, pointed at Felk's chest. The Winix stood tall and proud like the men, but his fingers flexed, ready to fight if it came to it. "He was never my pet," Karyne said. A tinkling sound met his ears as Felk threw his head back in laughter. Karyne paused, slightly stunned, but he recovered far faster than the general, whose arm lowered a good 6 inches, giving Felk room to step past. The creature's eyes lit up in the moonlight, reminiscent of how he'd looked in his younger state, and the Winix's arms rose to envelop the woman running straight for him.
"Mama!"
A murmur started in the crowd behind Daisy. She ignored them all, laughing as Felk spun her around. That same jealous twinge rose in Karyne, making him squirm. Now he was jealous of a Winix? She squeezed Felk tight, then pulled back, looking him over. "You've gotten so big again." She held her hand up to his, which was now twice as large as hers. His smile grew, revealing multiple rows of sharp teeth. The last time Karyne had seen him, half of those teeth had been missing because of declining health. Daisy reached out a hand to touch the black tear that stood out on the shine of Felk's silver cheek. "Are you all right?" Daisy asked. "Have they been treating you well?" He nodded and ducked his head.
"They've accepted me, even see me as a leader.
At first it was because they thought I'd know ways to defeat your kind, but when they finally understood you and I aren't enemies, they wanted me to teach them everything you'd taught me."
Daisy smiled and squeezed his shoulder. "That's wonderful."
Just so they can forget it with the new moon?
General Nels muttered.
What a waste.
He lifted his sword higher. Daisy turned, leveling the general with a glare even though he towered over her. "You might be gone before the new moon, and Silmar's still willing to work with you." A tinkling laughter filled the night air once more, and the general's face went slack. Karyne was more prepared this time, and he gave Felk a shove. "You're going to make real enemies if you keep that up." Felk gave another snarl, throwing out a hand to protect Daisy. "It's all right," she said, tugging his arm down. "Karyne is a friend. You knew him in another cycle." Karyne held out a hand. "I can show you if you'd like." Felk cocked his head and narrowed his eyes, but then he gripped Karyne's hand, his eyes fully closing as Karyne pushed memory after memory toward the Winnox. Daisy feeding and training him, wrestling with Karyne and Riverin, all of them laughing by the campfire. Even their farewell, which had been embarrassingly emotional for Karyne. Before meeting Felk, he hadn't thought this kind of magic could cross to a Winnox. Hadn't even considered hoping for it. Daisy's ability to have different perspectives and see other options, to see the possible good in everything, had rubbed off on him. Felk pulled away, his chest heaving as he blinked and regained his bearings.
I don't remember any of that."
Karyne nodded. And yet it all happened. Wetness clung to the Winnox's cheeks, and he leaned forward, pulling Karyne into a hug.
"Sorry,"
he mumbled, then pulled back, awkwardly rubbing his arms and staring at the forest floor. His face turned more serious than Karyne ever remembered seeing it, his intelligence far more than it had been when Karyne had known him. It seemed strange considering the Winnox couldn't retain their memories, but what if they retained other learned things? Karyne glanced over at Marnock, who was possibly the only one not staring at the strange scene before them. The older man's gaze remained intent on the fire, his brow furrowed. He didn't have memories, but he had instinctive knowledge along with general facts. What if their memory loss worked the same?
"I think my clan might have already made enemies."
Felk let out a small whine, like a dog on a scent, bringing Karyne's attention back to the Winnox, whose wide eyes glanced around the camp, taking in the frightened faces of those huddled around nearby fires.
"And I'm not talking about these people."
"So you think,"
General Nels muttered. Karyne glared at the general, then steered Felk and Daisy away from the rest of the camp's prying eyes. This cycle, Felk even walked more like a man, though his hands still had calloused palms, like he spent just as much time using the Winnox lope. They settled near a copse of trees that was mostly in shadow. An eerie glow came from Felk's skin, the reflected moonlight like a small light on their path. To Karyne's annoyance, the general followed, probably to eavesdrop more than provide protection. "What happened since you left us?" Daisy asked. "It feels like a lot when it's only been 5 days."
"We met up with a few other clans,"
Felk said.
"There's a witch in the east who sends her men out to hunt. They kill for sport, but gather our blood for the witch."
"Your blood?" Daisy's eyebrows knitted together as she worked her lower lip. "But you don't have star blood," Karyne said. Then, because nothing would surprise him anymore, he added, "Do you?" Felk shook his head.
"Not that I know of. She mixes our blood with some potion. We heard men talking about how it has regenerative properties. It restores life."
Daisy's gaze flicked to Karyne's. "That's not possible," Karyne said, even as he wondered if it could be. What was it about the Winnox that made them cycle each moon? They were like perennial flowers or Well, the moon. Karyne couldn't think of much else that functioned the same way. What if it was something in their blood, something that Mavis could harness and use to renew a body?
It heals people? The general asked. Or raises them from the dead?
Felk shrugged.
We only hear the soldiers talk. One claimed it brought him back, but another said the man had just been drunk, not dead.
His eyes closed to slits, and he leaned back for another laugh. Daisy and Karyne covered their ears, but the general was too slow. His eyes lost their focus, and he stared past the trees surrounding them. "Do you remember that we were traveling east to find Mavis?" Daisy asked. Felk nodded.
I assume she's the witch.
"It's a good description," Karyne said with a grin. Daisy elbowed him before turning back to Felk. "I can't guarantee we'll stop her, but—"
You can't tell him anything,
the general said, finally pulling himself from his stupor. He shifted and stood taller, elbowing his way between Daisy and Felk, who growled. "I'll tell him anything I please." Daisy's voice took on an edge that made Karyne's smile widen.
It's not your decision. The war effort is being run by the recreants, and I'll not have you putting all my soldiers in harm's way because you assume your pet is His words cut off with an undignified scream as Felk lifted him by his waist and set him aside with minimal effort. The Winix's sinewy muscles bulged in the moonlight, yet another way in which he'd changed from the last time Karyne had seen him.
Our clan has been tracking her soldiers. They take the blood in through a side entrance, part of an old dungeon system to remove dead bodies. They've even taken a few of our Winix in there alive.
Felk's teeth ground together, the noise putting Karyne on edge.
We suspect she bleeds them, but it's also possible she plans to breed them.
"Have you tried going in after them?" Karyne asked.
Of course not, the general said from behind Felk, because the information he's giving you is a setup for a trap.
Felk turned so fast the general jumped back.
I'm not lying,
the Winix ground out. Daisy grabbed his arm. "Ignore him." "We all do," Karyne added. Felk turned back and shook his head again. He blinked several times, and at first Karyne thought the creature was trying to regain control from his anger, but then the Winix wiped a tear from his eye.
We haven't gone in yet. The risk is too great, but they have Lilac.
Karyne glanced at Daisy, who seemed just as lost. "Who's—" she trailed off. "Oh, do you have a mate?" Daisy stumbled over the word.
She's the one who wanted to rescue me.
Pride leaked from his words even as more tears fell from his eyes.
And she was the first to stand down when you saved my life.
He used his shoulder to wipe his cheeks. Apparently, Karyne had missed even more than Daisy had. Daisy patted his shoulder. "Maybe we can help you get her back." "I hate to agree with the other guy," Karyne said, jabbing a thumb in the general's direction, "but we can't really take on another agenda for this mission." Daisy's sympathetic frown shifted to a glare that pinned Karyne down. "I meant that we could help each other. This could be a way in, both to save Lilac and to find my mother." Karyne opened his mouth to argue, but she had a fair point. He'd let Silmar fight that battle. Besides, anything that potentially upset Silmar's plans could also prevent the need for blood magic or sacrificing soldiers. He still couldn't understand why these people were so willing to attempt branding, not when they knew the consequences. Especially for Daisy. "We should ask Silmar about this other entrance," Karyne said. He had a map of the layout of Mavis's fortress. The entrance he wanted to use was closer to the back. I don't remember seeing anything else. "Doesn't mean it doesn't exist," he rushed to add. "In fact, maybe it's more reliable than his, which hasn't been verified for over a decade." "If it's more reliable," Daisy mused, "he'll be more likely to agree."
My clan also brought a peace offering.
Felk backed away from Daisy, nearly stepping on General Nels. Felk held out a hand, keeping Daisy at bay until he was a dozen paces away. Then he howled, the forlorn sound raising the hairs on Garen's arms. General Nels straightened, lifting his sword once more and holding it out toward the various shadows surrounding them. Even Daisy tensed, her gaze flicking between Felk and the shadows. Within moments, the shadows shifted, then glinted as moonlight struck the silvery skin of more Winnicks. The general swore as half a dozen emerged, but Garen placed a staying hand on the other man's arm. The Winnicks joining Felk were smaller, their bodies more hunched, like the predators Garen was used to seeing. They shifted from one foot to the other, slowly closing in on Daisy, Garen, and General Nels. Their lips curled in snarls, but they made no move to attack. One by one, they each brought forward a bundle of purple fabric on bolts, like ones Garen had seen the seamstress hauling through the palace. A wave of homesickness hit him, a startling sensation since he had no desire to be home. Thank you? Daisy placed a tentative hand on the pile of fabric.
We know you plan to attack tomorrow, Felk said. We hear your sentries talk.
General Nels stood straighter, and Garen felt sorry for whichever men had been on duty the last few nights.
My clan will help you,
Felk said,
if you also help them.
How does purple cloth help us? Garen asked, and General Nels snorted. Felk stepped forward, tore a strip of fabric from the nearest bolt, then leaned over Garen to tie it around his arm.
In battle, you will all look like our enemies. This way, we know who we shouldn't kill.
Daisy's smile grew until she let out a light laugh. She stepped around the fabric and reached for one of the Winnicks, drawing him into a hug. The general took a step forward, and Garen reached for his sword, barely holding back a protest that would earn him yet another glare. Thank you, she breathed out. The Winnicks didn't hug her back, but sniffed her shoulder and ear, his teeth far too close to her neck for Garen's liking. Even Felk tensed beside him, poised to intervene, but Daisy went down the line, hugging and thanking each of the creatures. A couple hugged her back, but most took the opportunity to learn her scent, the occasional growl sneaking out. It does seem like a genuine offer for help, Garen admitted, though his hand remained on his sword's hilt. The general grunted, but finally sheathed his weapon. 6 Winnicks against an army of thousands isn't much of an offer. Then you haven't seen them in action, Garen smiled, recalling the way Felk had protected Daisy. She seemed to attract defenders wherever she went. Besides, they said they ran into a few clans. I bet they have more like 30 to 50 out in the woods. How did you get so much fabric anyway? Daisy asked, gathering up bolts and shoving them in Garen's and General Nels's hands. Felk let out another small tinkling laugh, which the other Winnicks echoed. The effect was spellbinding, and Daisy, Garen, and the general all paused, blinking heavily as they fought to focus.
We stole it from a trader passing through, Felk said. If we can't find old nests, we have to make new ones for the eggs we plant. Then we save the rest for our rebirth.
Daisy hesitated, then sighed. I suppose there's nothing to be done about it for now, but in the future we're not going to steal. Is that understood? It was odd to see the massive Winnicks hunch over in shame, as if her words had physically wounded him.
Yes, Mama,
he mumbled. The other Winnicks grinned, their teeth flashing as they exchanged glances with each other. Leader or not, Felk would be teased relentlessly that night. It's too bad they didn't steal uniforms from Mavis's men while they were at it, General Nels said. Felk perked up.
You need uniforms?
The general frowned, addressing Garen instead of Felk.
It would be far easier to sneak into the castle with disguises.
Garen sighed and turned to Felk. That's a yes. Do you have some? Felk rolled his shoulders and glanced at the other Winnicks.
We've killed some of the soldiers who attacked us. Many of the uniforms are damaged, but we could bring the ones that aren't, or the ones that could be fixed.
Daisy shuddered but still nodded. That would be a great help. Even Garen found the idea of wearing a uniform off a dead soldier less than appealing, but he supposed it was better than showing up in his sailing leathers and tunic.
I'm surprised they didn't eat the soldiers, General Nels muttered.
Oh, we did,
Felk said, his mouth widening into something too large to be a smile. He leaned closer to the general.
The dried leather of the uniforms is disgusting, so we peel that off and go straight for the meat.
General Nels shrank back, his face growing sickly pale in the moonlight. Oh, Felk. Daisy made a face and lightly smacked Felk's arm. Stop teasing him. When she turned back toward camp, Felk's face drooped with guilt. Garen scanned the other Winnicks, who licked their lips. One even closed his eyes and rubbed his belly. Garen's own stomach churned with revulsion and trepidation. He wanted to assume Felk had more influence over these Winnicks than they did over him, but by the time they knew for sure, it might be too late.
I hope you enjoyed listening to the latest installment of Blood of the Stars by Karyne Norton. If you enjoy listening to this narration, you might also enjoy listening to his audio dramas at spiritblade.com or his podcast, Christian Geek Central, where he discusses movies, video games, and all things enjoyed by self-proclaimed geeks from a Christian worldview. Thanks so much for listening.